Hi everybody, and welcome to Big Joe's Journal. My name is Joe Tilden, and I am the host of this program. Well, it's rather hard to believe that we're halfway through the year 2019. And as we hit the 1st of July, the second big holiday of the summer season is upon us, and probably the most important holiday, and that is the 4th of July. On the 4th of July, 2019, we're going to be celebrating the 243rd birthday of the United States of America. In the United States, our birth date, July 4th, 1776, at Convention Hall, or what became known as Constitutional Hall, in Philadelphia. Following the war of the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, Great Britain pretty much controlled the vast majority of the North American continent. It had defeated the French, taking over Canada and all French possessions down through the St. Lawrence Valley and the Mississippi Valley. The other big power, European power in North America, of course, was Spain, which had Florida and a strip of land along the Gulf Coast into what is now Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Colorado, up through there. In the far northwest, Russia was populating Alaska, or taking possession of Alaska, mainly for the fur trade. Well, upon completing the French and Indian War, Great Britain wanted the colonists to pay for it. Now, the colonists had flexed their muscles a bit during that war because much of the fighting, rather than being done by regular British troops, had been done by militia troops from the colonies. Great Britain also was involved in another war with France, which to them was much more important. And that was the battle over India, particularly much of southern, southeastern Asia. Both England and France were claiming territory that is now India and Pakistan, country that formerly was known as Burma, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Malaysia, all down through there. And this land would be fought over, and Great Britain, more or less war-wise, was focusing on that part of the world. The people in Britain, especially the upper crust, sort of looked at the colonies over here, the 13 colonies, as what we'd call today maybe a bunch of hillbillies. Upon conquering Canada, Great Britain sensed that there was going to probably be a little bit of trouble with the colonies. There had been, uprisings before. Much of the people that had come from Great Britain and settled in the colonies had been people that had been dissatisfied in England for one reason or another, over religion, over employment, over a future. The primary thing, of course, was freedom of religion, the freedom to worship. Well, England wanted to avoid these problems with their newly conquered territory in Canada. So Parliament passed a series of acts called the Quebec Act. And this guaranteed freedom of religion to the people of Canada. Now, the people of Quebec, of course, being of French descent, were primarily Catholic. And it was to keep things under control in Canada that the Quebec Act was passed. Well, as the colonists saw this, they looked on it as unjust. They were also concerned about an increase in taxes. Great Britain wanted the colonists to pick up, well, probably most of the tab for the French and Indian War, pay for the housing of British troops, and a number of other things. Well, over here in the colonies, that didn't sit too well, especially in Massachusetts, which was a hotbed of rebellion, and also Virginia. And with the war ending in 1763, there was 2 or 3 years of peace, but that unrest was building. especially in Massachusetts and especially in Virginia. And so consequently, in 1774, you had the Boston Tea Party. You had the Boston Massacre. 1775, you had the battles of Lexington, Concord. And you later have the battle of what we call Bunker's Hill, which was actually fought on Breed's Hill in Boston. Well, the first convention came together. The 13 colonies began to be a little bit concerned, and they decided to take a shot at some sort of unity. And the first convention held in Philadelphia was rather inconclusive. You know, what are we going to do? Well, they finally decided if we offer enough resistance, maybe we will get the Crown to listen to our complaints, and maybe we will have a voice in what Parliament does. In Virginia, a fiery orator named Patrick Henry had already sounded what would become one of the battle cries of the Revolution. You know, no taxation without representation. It's a cry that is still prevalent here in the United States today. We are very, very concerned when government passes taxes for one reason or another. That's why we elect our legislators. To say, well, you know, let's keep it within reason. The colonies had no say in how they were taxed. And you had somebody like Patrick Henry saying, give me liberty or give me death, and so forth. You had another radical author by the name of Thomas Paine talking about injustice being done here in the 13 colonies. So with armed conflict already having taken place, when the second convention met in Philadelphia in 1776, they had to make a decision to go one way or another. Do we still want to be part of the British Empire? Or do we want to go full-fledged for independence? Well, this decision to go independence was not unanimous, not by a long shot. A lot of people felt a certain loyalty to the mother country and felt that they'd be better off if they stayed connected with that mother country. But Congress had to make a decision. The Continental Congress had to make a decision. And so they appointed a committee of 5. It consisted of Thomas Jefferson and George Mason of Virginia, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, John Adams of Massachusetts, and Charles Pinckney of New York, to come up with some sort of declaration, if you will, stating what the colonies wanted. And the decision, as I said, was not unanimous, but it was decided to go all the way and become independent. Benjamin Franklin sort of summed that up when he said, we must all hang together, or we should all be hung separately. So it was that Thomas Jefferson was assigned to be the author of our Declaration of Independence. The individual that would sell the Declaration of Independence to the members of the convention would be John Adams, who was had a reputation of being a fine oratorical lawyer. And so Thomas Jefferson, with advice and input from the other 4 members of that group, set about drawing up the Declaration, what we call today the Declaration of Independence. When he had finished drawing up the document, which was quite lengthy, he presented it to the delegates at the convention, and it was approved by a majority vote. Again, not unanimously. This was on July 2nd. On July 4th, it was promulgated to the public It was read in front of Convention Hall, what we now call Independence Hall. And copies of it were sent by a courier, and it was delivered by horseback, as you know, that was the main means of communication in those days. On the 8th of July, at Mount Independence in Orwell, Vermont, and at Fort Ticonderoga, the military commander there, General St. Clair, read the Declaration of Independence to the troops at Mount Independence and later at Fort Ticonderoga. And so July 4th became our Independence Day. And for 243 years, or at least this year, 243 years, across the country, we will celebrate our independence. Independence did not come cheaply, and has not been maintained cheaply. 243 years, actually, we're still a very young country compared to, say, our neighbors in Europe and Asia. We're still a youngster. But if you look at the tremendous progress from 1776 to 2019, our forefathers, in their wildest imaginations, could never have imagined the tremendous democracy, the tremendous nation that they would create. And of course, it took a Revolutionary War for independence, Yorktown. It took a Constitutional Convention in 1787, also in Philadelphia, to lay the groundwork and to bring this country together. And this is a Constitution which has had 27 amendments to it. Originally, there were only 7 parts to the original Constitution. But it has had 27 amendments, and it is still a law of the land. It has been challenged. The Civil War was the major challenge to this Constitution. And there have been other challenges here, there, and everywhere. But the Constitution still reigns supreme. What brought the Constitution into being? It took the Declaration of Independence to give it birth, if you will, and give it foundation. And so with that, I want to read not all of the Declaration of Independence because it's rather lengthy, but the important parts here. And one of the most important parts to me, and one of the goals of our country that we are trying to achieve, we haven't achieved yet, and probably won't in my lifetime. They're probably not in your lifetime either, but we're getting there. And that is the second paragraph of this Declaration of Independence. I think it's probably one of the greatest pieces of literature ever put together. All right. The writing of Thomas Jefferson, action of the Second Continental Congress, July 4th, 1776, the official date. And it says here, the Declaration of the 13 United States of America, the Declaration of the 13 United States of America. Well, while the number of votes in the Congress itself was not unanimous, the fact that all 13 states had a majority approving it, it was regarded as unanimous. In other words, all 13 accepted it, although not all delegates did. All right, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. And paragraph 2, which I think is extremely important. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity that constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. And he goes on to list the various abuses that King George III and Parliament had inflicted upon the colonies. And, you know, the reasons why they were going to go independent. All right, he concludes, and we're going to go toward the end of the Declaration of Independence now. We have skipped over the numerous abuses that King George has inflicted upon the 13 colonies. The last one here, he has incited domestic insurrections among us. In other words, if you're wondering why there are so many small rebellions breaking out here and there, there's the guy sitting on the throne in England. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers. And here he talks about the merciless Indian savages. Well, that's unfortunate, but that's the way they felt at that time. They were afraid of the savages. And of course, Native Americans felt that they were being mistreated, their land was being stolen. And of course, they fought back. And it was a problem. And really today, it continued to be a problem through most of our history, through the bulk of our history. And of course, today, you know, the Native Americans were defeated, their lands were taken, they were subjected to really inhumane treatment. A number of treaties with the government were not honored by the government. And, well, it was a bad situation all around that we will discuss at other times. And what this last article of abuse that Thomas Jefferson talks about, that in many areas the British were encouraging the Native Americans to resist the advance of the colonies into their territory. In other words, the 13 colonies were along the Atlantic coast. And of course, just a matter of time, and they'd already started venturing out across the Appalachians into what is now the Midwest. All right. At every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Now, have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren? We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature, meaning their parliament, the British Parliament, to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. And then the concluding paragraph. We therefore, representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all the other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And with that, the die had been cast. It was no longer going to be a war to get Great Britain to recognize the rights of the colonists, but it would become a war for independence. And of course, it was a war that in the beginning did not go well. George Washington's army was pretty much a piecemeal thing. It started off mainly being militias from Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Also, there was another piece of territory that would declare its independence and would become a, if you will, a separate nation for a short time. And of course, that was the state of Vermont. In 1777, at Windsor, the Vermont State Constitution was drawn up, and Vermont more or less became an independent nation, and with that for 14 years, 1777 to 1791, when we came into the Union. Well, we know the war began in Massachusetts, and it pretty much became a standoff there. Or, if you will, you might say maybe the colonists had the upper hand, because they did compel the British to abandon Boston and move to New York. The Battle of Bunker Hill could be called a colonial victory. Lexington, we'd have to give that to the British. Concord, we'd have to say that evened it off. But after the Battle of Bunker Hill, the colonists were pretty much in command of that area. And thus the British set sail out of Boston, and they headed for New York. And they made a very strong stand in New York. In fact, they British would not totally vacate New York until 2 years after the war was over, in 1783, and that was part of the Treaty of Paris, which actually ended a state of war between Great Britain and the new country, the United States. And as part of that treaty, the British were forced to evacuate New York. But once they took over New York, they stayed there until 1783. Well, your question was, what's going to happen over here? Here you've got 13 separate little nations. The thing that brought them together was the idea for independence from Great Britain. And you had a very loose form of government drawn up called the Articles of Confederation. It recognized the convention at Philadelphia as being the central government on a temporary basis. There's really no power for taxation. Washington's army, particularly at Valley Forge, went through a very cold and a very bitter winter. There was no way Congress could impose taxes on the colonies to help pay for this army. The result was that a banker in Philadelphia, who had been one of the members of the Constitutional Convention, Gouverneur Morris, was able to raise enough money through the banking system at that time to more or less fund the Continental Army and keep it going. Fortunately, we had a number of military experts that came over from Europe that joined the cause. And of course, the big thing that turned it around was the Battle of Saratoga, which the colonists won. They defeated a first-rate British army under the command of General John Burgoyne in October of 1777. And France, who were losing the war in India, really, to the British, were looking for a chance maybe to get back. And here it was, with the colonists having a chance to win, France decided, at the urging of our ambassador over there, who was Benjamin Franklin, to render help to the colonies. And this they did with a strong fleet and I won't say a strong army, but an effective army. And they would land in Rhode Island. The first French troops to come to the aid of the colonists would land in Rhode Island. And they would strengthen our Continental Army. Their arrival here affected the British in such a way that Lord Cornwallis, who had been appointed British commander, moved the war to the south. For some reason, their strategy said, well, with the French up here, let's see if we can take the southern colonies, take Georgia. Georgia had been established by people who had been freed, well, not freed, but released from debtor prison and sent overseas. James Oglethorpe, who was he'd been a social worker, if we were around today, established a colony for folks that were way in debt and had no way of paying it off. And to get them out of debtor's prison, he offered them land over here in the New World. And many, many people accepted it and came over here. So the British decided to hit down there and come up through the Carolinas and so forth. But this strategy failed, as we know, at Yorktown, when French and American troops in the French Navy blocked off the British and forced Cornwallis to surrender in 1781. So, as we head into the summer, I want to wish everybody that let's enjoy the summer while we've got it. It has come late, and it's probably going to be rather short, but enjoy this holiday. And when you do, you know, whether you're having a cookout or whether you're at the beach or at a ball game or whatever, remember the courage of our founding fathers who put everything on the line and said, let's go for broke. Let's become independent. May Almighty God in His infinite wisdom continue to bless these United States of America Have a great July 4th, everybody. See you all next week.